There are moments in history where the world moves to the edge and stops, not because the danger disappears, but because one decision changes everything. In October 1962, the United States faced a reality that could not be ignored. Nuclear missiles just miles from its shores, armed, operational, capable of reaching American cities in minutes. For the first time, the Cold War wasn't distant. It was immediate, and the question wasn't whether there was a threat. The question was how to respond without triggering a war that could end everything. This is the story of the Naval Blockade that forced the Soviet Union to back down, the moment where control, restraint, and strategy prevented a nuclear catastrophe. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global competition that extended far beyond ideology. It was about influence, power, and the ability to shape the future. Both sides possessed nuclear weapons. Both sides had the capability to inflict massive destruction. And both sides understood that a direct conflict could escalate beyond control. For years, that balance had held, not because the threat wasn't real, but because it was understood. But in 1962, something changed. U.S. intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, a location less than 100 miles from the United States, close enough to strike with little warning, close enough to shift the strategic balance. Suddenly, the distance that had once provided security was gone, and with it, the margin for error disappeared. Inside Washington, the situation was clear. This couldn't be ignored. But responding carried its own risks. A direct military strike could eliminate the missiles, but it could also trigger retaliation, not just in Cuba, but globally. The Soviet Union could respond in Europe. Escalation could spread, and within days or even hours, the conflict could become nuclear. The United States needed a response that was strong, but controlled, decisive, but measured. The challenge wasn't just to remove the threat. It was to do so without igniting a war, because in a nuclear standoff, even the right decision could lead to the wrong outcome. Time was limited, pressure was building, and every option carried consequences. Do nothing, and the missiles would become operational. Strike and risk immediate escalation. Negotiate and appear weak. There was no clear path, only risk in every direction. The solution that emerged wasn't the most aggressive, but it was the most strategic. A naval blockade, officially called a quarantine. U.S. naval forces would surround Cuba, intercept Soviet ships, prevent additional military equipment from reaching the island. It was a move that demonstrated strength without immediate escalation. It created pressure without triggering direct conflict. And most importantly, it gave time for decisions, time for communication, time to avoid a mistake that could not be reversed. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where strategy prevented catastrophe, consider subscribing, because what happened next wasn't just a standoff. It was a test of control at the highest level. Because once the blockade was in place, the world held its breath and waited to see who would move next. As the blockade took shape, the scale of the operation became clear. U.S. Navy ships moved into position around Cuba, forming a line across the Atlantic approaches. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, each assigned a role, each positioned with precision. This wasn't a symbolic move. It was real, enforced, and every ship that approached the line would be challenged, inspected, or turned back. Above them, reconnaissance aircraft continued to fly missions over Cuba, capturing images of missile sites under construction, launchers, transport vehicles, support infrastructure, proof that the threat was not hypothetical. It was active, and it was growing. Inside command centers, information flowed constantly. Radar contacts, ship movements, communications from across the globe. Because this wasn't just a naval operation, it was a global moment. Every action, every signal could influence what happened next. For the United States, the objective was clear: stop the buildup, force the Soviet Union to reconsider, but avoid direct confrontation. Because the moment a shot was fired, everything could change. At the same time, Soviet ships were already en route. Cargo vessels, tankers, escorted by submarines, carrying equipment that could reinforce the missile installations. And now, they were heading directly toward the blockade. The distance between the two sides was closing, hour by hour, mile by mile. Inside Washington, the tension was constant. Updates came in, positions adjusted, options reviewed, because no one knew how the Soviets would respond. Would they turn back? Would they attempt to break the blockade? Would they escort their ships through with force? Each possibility carried risk, and each required a different response. Out at sea, U.S. naval crews prepared for the moment of contact. Rules of engagement were clear. Ships would signal, warn, and if necessary, take action. But the goal remained the same: avoid escalation. Because even a small incident, a misunderstanding, a miscalculation, could trigger something far larger. The Soviet ships continued their approach. Closer, closer, until finally they reached the line, the moment that had been anticipated, the moment that could define everything. American ships tracked their movements carefully. Communication channels were opened, signals sent, warnings issued, and then something unexpected happened. Some of the Soviet ships slowed, changed course, turned away, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, enough to signal hesitation. It was the first indication that the blockade was having an effect, that the pressure was working. But the situation was far from resolved, because not all ships turned back. And beneath the surface, another layer of tension was unfolding. Soviet submarines were operating in the area, submerged, armed, and difficult to track. U.S. naval forces began detecting their presence, dropping signaling charges, attempting to force them to surface, to identify them. But those actions carried risk, because from the perspective of a submerged submarine, those signals could be interpreted as aggression. And if a submarine commander believed he was under attack, he might respond. And if that response involved nuclear weapons, the situation could escalate instantly. At the same time, inside Cuba, missile installations continued to progress. Time was running out. The longer the standoff continued, the closer those missiles came to full operational status, which meant that the window for resolution was narrowing. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried weight. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where every moment could change the course of history, consider subscribing, because what followed next wasn't just tension. It was the closest the world had come to nuclear war, because while ships turned away on the surface, beneath it and inside Cuba, the crisis was still building, and it was about to reach its most dangerous point. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. What had begun as a strategic move was now a global standoff. Every hour brought new risks. Every decision carried consequences that could not be reversed. Inside Cuba, missile sites were nearing operational readiness. Launch systems were being assembled, warheads prepared. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was becoming real, and time was running out. At sea, the blockade held. But beneath the surface, the situation grew more dangerous. U.S. forces detected Soviet submarines operating near the quarantine line, silent, hidden, and in some cases, armed with nuclear torpedoes. The challenge was clear: force them to surface, identify them, but avoid escalation. U.S. Navy ships began using signaling charges, small explosive devices intended to communicate, not attack. A message: surface, identify yourself. But in the confined environment of a submarine, that message wasn't always clear. Inside one Soviet submarine, deep below the surface, conditions were deteriorating. The vessel had been submerged for extended periods. Air quality was declining, temperatures rising. Communication with command was limited, and outside, explosions echoed through the water. From the crew's perspective, it felt like an attack. Confusion, stress, uncertainty. And in that environment, decisions became harder, because the submarine carried something that changed everything: a nuclear torpedo, a weapon capable of destroying an entire naval formation, and the authority to use it rested with the officers on board. For a moment, the possibility became real. The decision to launch was considered, debated, balanced between survival and escalation, because if they fired, the response would be immediate, and the situation would spiral beyond control. But in that moment, the decision was made not to launch. A pause, a reassessment, a choice that prevented everything from changing. Above the surface, the blockade continued. Ships maneuvered, signals exchanged, tension remained constant. But the crisis wasn't only unfolding at sea. In the skies above Cuba, U.S. reconnaissance flights continued to gather intelligence, flying directly over missile sites, documenting progress, providing information that shaped every decision. And then, one of those aircraft was shot down. AU-2 reconnaissance plane, destroyed over Cuban territory. The pilot killed. It was a moment that could have triggered immediate retaliation, a direct military response, an escalation that might have made the situation irreversible. Inside Washington, the pressure reached its peak. Options were reviewed again, military strikes prepared, forces placed on high alert, because now the crisis had crossed another line. There had been a loss, and the expectation of response grew. But again, restraint held, because every decision was measured not just by its immediate effect, but by what it could lead to next. At the highest levels, communication between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified. Messages sent, received, interpreted, each word carrying weight, each proposal examined carefully, because behind those messages was a shared understanding that neither side wanted to cross the final line, but both needed a way to step back without appearing to surrender. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where the most critical decisions were made under unimaginable pressure, consider subscribing, because what happened next wasn't just resolution, it was a turning point. Because after days of tension, miscalculation, and near catastrophe, a path forward finally began to emerge, one that would end the crisis, without war, but not without consequence. In the end, the resolution came not through force, but through control. Behind closed doors, messages moved between Washington and Moscow, carefully worded, deliberately paced, each side searching for a way out that preserved strength without pushing the other too far. The agreement, when it came, was precise. The Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba, dismantle the sites, withdraw the threat that had brought the world to the edge. In return, the United States would publicly commit not to invade Cuba, and privately, it would remove its own missiles from Turkey. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no celebrations, no declarations of dominance, only a quiet understanding that both sides had stepped back in time. The blockade remained in place until the process began. Ships continued to hold their positions. Aircraft continued their surveillance, because until the missiles were confirmed to be leaving, the risk remained. But gradually, the tension began to ease. Soviet vessels turned away. Missile components were loaded onto ships. Launch sites were dismantled. Piece by piece, the crisis was reversed. What had once been a direct threat was removed, and with it, the immediate danger of nuclear war. For the United States, the naval blockade had achieved something critical. It had applied pressure without triggering escalation. It had forced a response without firing a shot, and it had demonstrated that strength could be exercised with restraint, because the objective had never been destruction. It had been control. Control of the situation, control of the response, control of a moment that could have spiraled beyond anything seen before. For the Soviet Union, the outcome was equally significant. The missiles were withdrawn, but the confrontation had revealed the risks of pushing too far, of testing limits in a world where the consequences were no longer contained. And that realization shaped future decisions, because the crisis had exposed something deeper, not just the power of nuclear weapons, but the danger of miscalculation, of actions taken without full understanding of how the other side would respond. The naval blockade became a defining example of how to manage that danger, a strategy that balanced force with restraint, pressure with patience. And in doing so, it helped prevent a conflict that could have changed the course of history. In the years that followed, The lessons of that moment remained. Communication improved. Direct lines were established between leaders. Efforts were made to reduce the risk of misunderstanding, because both sides had seen how close the world had come and how fragile that balance could be. Today, the legacy of that blockade is still felt, not just in military strategy, but in how crises are managed, how power is applied, and how restraint can be just as important as action, because in the Cold War, the greatest victories were not always the ones that were visible. They were the ones where conflict was avoided, where decisions prevented escalation, where control held, even under pressure. And in October 1962, as ships faced each other across the ocean, that control made the difference. For more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because some of the most important moments in history weren't defined by what happened, but by what didn't happen.